Biggest news in America this week and possibly this year is the record-shattering success of the Caped Crusader in the new film Batman Returns.
But it's got to be broad enough so that only your voice can convey the story.
Harley Quinn, pleased to meet ya.
That's a scene from Batman Mask of the Phantasm, a Batman animated feature that was made in 1993, and Roger and I never reviewed it, and as far as I'm concerned, we made a big mistake because it's terrific.
Critics are calling it the best Batman ever.
There's no real interest in the Batman and Robin character.
Tim Burton is another level of filmmaker than Joel Schumacher.
You can see the new Batman Superman adventures every weekday and each weekend here on Kids WB.
The best opportunity since May of 1939 to join the Batman saga.
The 90s was one hell of a decade to be a Batman fan. In the early years, there were iconic movies, TV shows, and comic books coming out back to back, growing the popularity of Batman like never before. However, by the end of the decade, the successful Batman franchise came crashing down, with terrible movies, polarizing TV shows, and controversial comics. The rise and fall of Batman in the 90s is fascinating, but in order to fully explore the journey of Batman in the 90s, and to understand the impact that this decade had in the Batman fandom, we first need to talk about what came before, in the late 1980s. In the 1970s and the early 1980s, Batman was completely divided. On the one hand, you had the comic books, where Batman was a serious detective and a crime fighter. For the most part, those stories presented horror elements and dangerous enemies, but this Batman was not exactly popular, and his audience was very niche. On the other hand, there was the slightly more popular mainstream Batman, who lived in the collective minds of society thanks to reruns of the 1960s TV show and his constant presence in children's cartoons. This division resulted in a bad conflict between the mainstream media and the comic books, a conflict that lasted for the entire Bronze Age of comics, in which the mainstream Batman was winning. However, this was not a good thing, as this version of Batman started to go out of fashion in the mid-1980s, with Batman rapidly losing popularity in the mainstream media and the sales of the Batman comics reaching new lows. The future of the character was uncertain. DC Comics soon realized that they had only two options: to let the character fade into obscurity or to reinvent Batman completely. This defining moment happened in 1986, when artist and writer Frank Miller single-handedly tilted the scales of the battle in favor of the comics version of Batman, with the publication of The Dark Knight Returns. This book revolutionized the comic book industry, but most importantly, it changed Batman, introducing adult themes such as real-world politics, corruption, and a grounded approach to psychological issues to the Batman comics. The groundbreaking story of an aging Batman brought a new vision of what the character could be, and revealed an untapped storytelling potential. One of the editors involved in The Dark Knight Returns was Denny O'Neil, the legendary Batman writer who revitalized Batman in the 1970s and who always advocated for a more serious and obsessive Batman. After the critical success of The Dark Knight Returns, O'Neil became the editor of the Batman comics in 1986, and his first assignment was to reboot the continuity of Batman in the aftermath of the epic DC Comics storyline called Crisis on Infinite Earths. Batman was desperately in need of a reboot, but in the few months following the crisis, the stories didn't change at all. Denny O'Neil quickly realized this was a problem, and just a few months after becoming the Batman editor, he presented the definitive origin story of Batman in 1986 with Batman Year One. The story was a crucial success that helped establish the new continuity for Batman, as the overwhelming majority of comic book fans embraced the new origin story. Much of the success of Year One comes from the collaboration between writer Frank Miller and artist Dave Mazzucchelli, who presented a true crime thriller that showcased Batman's crime-fighting nature, delivering a much more grounded story than anything that had come before. Frank Miller clearly had a better grasp at what made Batman work, more than any other writer at the time, which is why it's a baffling mystery why he didn't write any more Batman stories after Year One. Like, how come DC Comics didn't keep their best and most successful Batman writer for a whole run? Or at least a couple more storylines? Though the truth might be a mystery, there have been rumors about a falling out between Frank Miller and editor Denny O'Neil in the process of making Batman Year One. Apparently, Frank Miller originally wanted Year One to be a prequel to The Dark Knight Returns, which would make sense as both the stories feel like they are part of the same universe. After having successfully created what could be Batman's last story, Miller wanted to create his own version of Batman's first story, and both in the same continuity. Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli had even planned to make Year One a graphic novel, to be published as a prestige format book, just like The Dark Knight Returns. However, those plans were changed at the last minute by DC Comics, most specifically by editor Denny O'Neil, who needed a new origin story for Batman and saw Year One as the best opportunity for a fresh new start. O'Neil managed to work Year One into the monthly Batman comic, which was not what the creators originally wanted, and as rumors have it, that's why Frank Miller refused to work again with Denny O'Neil, which would explain why he didn't work on Batman again until O'Neil retired in the early 2000s. However, Frank Miller and Denny O'Neil would eventually cross paths once again while working on Batman in the 90s. So remember this, because it's gonna come up later in the video. Now, Frank Miller might have refused to keep working on Batman, but the influence of his work and the impact of his stories were felt all throughout the following years. For instance, one of the most remarkable things about Miller's work is how he turned Batman's origin story into the most important character trait for Batman, allowing this tragic event to shape and define every single aspect of the larger Batman mythos. The origin of Batman played an extremely important role both in The Dark Knight Returns and Year One, to the point that the character of Batman was never the same after the huge success of these iconic stories. Before Frank Miller, Batman was a well-rounded character with friends, family, and even a social life, a comic book hero in the more traditional sense of the word. But clearly that portrayal of Batman wasn't working, because as soon as Miller introduced his ideas about the character, they changed Batman forever, because they made sense in a more logical, grounded, and realistic context. Both The Dark Knight Returns and Year One gained huge critical recognition, and these two stories coming out back-to-back in 1986 started a new chapter that I like to call the Frank Millerization of Batman, where a large number of stories followed the style and influence of Frank Miller. For instance, after Batman Year One was finished, DC Comics created Batman Year Two, a story that was promoted as a direct sequel to Year One, although calling this a sequel is like calling the sky red. Year Two had none of the things that made Miller's work great, but at least it was illustrated by Todd McFarlane, a young artist that became one of comics' biggest names in the 90s, and naturally, he will also show up later in the video. DC Comics also rebooted the origin story of Jason Todd, the second Robin, in order to bring some of Miller's grounded approach to the character. However, none of the new Batman writers really understood the new serious direction the stories required, and soon DC Comics started looking for their next Frank Miller. In 1987, Jim Starlin became the new Batman writer, and for the most part, his entire catalog of Batman stories were directly influenced by Frank Miller's work. Like Miller, Starlin's Batman is a ruthless and violent vigilante, motivated mostly by vengeance and, of course, his tragic origin. One of Starling's earliest stories is 10 Nights of the Beast, where the KG Beast, a deadly Russian assassin, infiltrates Gotham, and Batman has to work with the US government to stop him. The story is a clear effort to showcase politics, the Cold War, and other relevant issues, and going as far as including a cameo of President Ronald Reagan, just like what Miller did in The Dark Knight Returns. Jim Starlin then came up with The Cold, a graphic novel about urban decay, the downfall of Gotham, and the uprising of Batman against a false messiah in what is, very obviously, a poor imitation of The Dark Knight Returns. DC Comics didn't hide the fact that they were taking inspiration from Frank Miller's work at every chance they got, and they didn't stop until 1988, when writer Jim Starlin, encouraged by DC Comics, created Batman: A Death in the Family, the story where Robin is killed by the Joker in one of the most controversial moments of Batman's history. The Batman editor Denny O'Neil came up with the idea of leaving the decision to save or kill Robin to the readers, who could call a phone number and cast their votes and decide the fate of Robin. Though the results were very close, people decided that Robin should not live, creating a lot of controversy not only in the comic book fandom, but in the mainstream media at large. The stunt backfired badly, and DC Comics received a lot of negative press surrounding this event. It got so bad that Jim Starlin was immediately fired from writing Batman, and from DC Comics altogether. On the positive side, all this publicity and promotion made everyone realize what a terrible story A Death in the Family actually is, as it quickly devolves into utter nonsense when the Joker becomes an international ambassador at the United Nations and Batman tries to fight Superman in a very obvious effort of using politics and the same conflicts of The Dark Knight Returns yet again. At this point, DC Comics had recycled too many ideas from Frank Miller, including the concept of killing Robin, which came from The Dark Knight Returns, where Robin was killed by the Joker. The dark and gritty ideas of Frank Miller had clearly taken over the Batman comics, because even if Robin had survived, DC Comics was most likely getting rid of Robin in some other way, like they did with Batgirl. In 1988, only a couple of months before A Death in the Family, DC Comics published The Killing Joke, which was another graphic novel that followed the dark, gritty and grounded concepts established by Frank Miller. The Killing Joke was written by Alan Moore, one of the greatest comic book writers of all time, who was also responsible for making dark stories in the late 1980s. In The Killing Joke, Alan Moore and artist Brian Boland explored the possible origin story of the Joker, and presented a vicious story about Joker torturing Commissioner Gordon, with images of his brutalized daughter Barbara, who was shot and paralyzed by the Joker in an attempt to drive Gordon insane. Unlike A Death in the Family, however, The Killing Joke was a big critical and commercial success, becoming one of the best-selling comics of 1988 and winning 3 Eisner Awards in 1989 for Best Writer, Best Artist, and Best Graphic Novel. In other words, killing Robin is bad, but destroying Batgirl?
This is immaculate, man.
Regardless of these double standards, the success of stories like The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke was the biggest evidence that the comic book fandom at large truly enjoyed this new era of dark and gritty Batman stories. Long gone were the days of the friendly Batman, and after taking notice of this radical change over the last 3 years, the powers that be decided that it was time to bring those kind of dark stories to the mainstream image of Batman. In 1989, Warner Brothers released the movie Batman, featuring a dark and serious Batman, unlike anything the mainstream audiences had ever seen before. Even though the pre-production of this film started a decade earlier, in the late 1970s, none of the major film studios were interested in Batman or took the character seriously back then, as Batman was still associated with the campy version from the 1960s. For that reason, the movie fell into production hell, never to be picked up again until the late 1980s, when the commercial success of the new Batman comics finally convinced Hollywood that Batman could indeed be a serious character. With the questionable casting choice of Michael Keaton as Batman and the greatest casting choice of Jack Nicholson as the Joker, Tim Burton was hired to direct the movie, and thanks to his vision of a dark Batman that existed in a world of nightmares, the movie became an unprecedented success, breaking every box office record and literally starting a new Batmania that completely changed the image of Batman in the mainstream media. The marketing campaign for the movie and the following merchandising craze was a phenomenon that was never seen before, and which has not been quite replicated. There were video games, magazines, trading cards, toys, clothing,
boxes of Bat bubblegum cards. Empty boxes, they're all gone.
The Batman brand was everywhere, and it became so big that chances are you've probably owned something, anything, with this logo at some point in your life. And it all started here. 1989 was the year of Batman, and this huge level of success naturally extended to the comic books, turning Batman into literally the best-selling comic book on the market. Even strange stories sold well, like Arkham Asylum, a serious house on Serious Earth. This was a graphic novel written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Dave McKean, who created some of the most bizarre visuals for a Batman story. This book was so expensive and so weird that, in my opinion, it shouldn't have been successful. But because it came out the same year as the Batman movie, it became one of Batman's best-selling graphic novels of all time. The demand for Batman was so high that DC Comics was able to create a new Batman comic, the first one in over 40 years. It was called Legends of the Dark Knight, and it showcased stories from Batman's early days. By 1989, the Batman Year One collections were selling incredibly well, so DC Comics dedicated the new title to chronicle more Batman adventures set around the same time as Year One, with stories that followed more closely the style of Frank Miller's origin. The first issue of Legends of the Dark Knight became the best-selling comic book in September of 1989, with more than 500,000 copies sold, at least 5 times more than the average best-selling comics back then. The success of issue number 1 of Legends of the Dark Knight was also in part because of the 5 different covers, which actually were identical except for the different colors. However, the Batmania of 1989 caused people to buy all 5 copies of the same book just to collect the covers, becoming the first time in history that a comic book sold more copies thanks to variant covers. Legends of the Dark Knight continued to dominate the sales figures of 1989, but it was not the only Batman title that benefited from Batman's popularity. In 1989, Detective Comics was being written by Alan Grant, a Scottish comic book writer, and according to him, Detective Comics was selling around 75,000 copies on average, but after the Batman movie was released, that number went up to 650,000 copies per issue. The main Batman title was also among the best-selling comics at the time, which was especially important because DC Comics was publishing the storylines Year 3 and A Lonely Place of Dying, both stories that explored what made Robin important in the first place, and also introduced Tim Drake as the new Robin. The character of Tim Drake was named after Tim Burton, the director of the Batman film, and thanks to the movie, a lot of people were introduced to the new Robin. In fact, Year 3 and A Lonely Place of Dying are stories that showcase the negative effects of Batman becoming increasingly violent, to the point where he and his close friends realize he needs an intervention. He needs to slow down and become a little brighter. And in a way, these two stories work like a self-aware commentary of how DC Comics had allowed Batman to become too much like Frank Miller's vision of the character. But now that they had found huge success thanks to the movie, the creators of the Batman comics finally had enough confidence to move on and leave Frank Miller's Batman in the past. The days of the Dark Batman were over. They will forever remain a thing of the 80s, but the Dark Knight was now ready to start a new chapter. Batman was finally ready to start the 90s. By the end of the 1980s and at the start of the 90s, the Batman editor Denny O'Neil stopped looking for writers who could replicate the Batman of Frank Miller, and instead he started looking for writers capable of telling good Batman stories. One such writer was Alan Grant, the Scottish writer who, alongside artist Norm Breyfogle, started a brilliant run in Detective Comics in the late 1980s. While the other Batman comics tried to replicate Frank Miller, Grant and Breyfogle were doing their own thing, creating fantastic stories and starting a renaissance in the Batman comics, introducing iconic villains like the Ventriloquist and the Scarface, Anarchy, the Ratcatcher, and many more unique enemies. The creativity of Alan Grant and Norm Breyfogle was unmatched, as no other creative team of the 80s or 90s introduced so many new and successful characters to the Batman mythos. Alan Grant's Batman was obsessive, but never extremely dark. The stories were a bit outlandish, but always focused on action, and the awesome and expressive art of Norm Breyfogle complemented the stories perfectly. Their work was so successful that they were eventually promoted to the main Batman title at the start of the 90s, and in less than a year they got their own series in a brand new title called Batman: Shadow of the Bat. However, finding such an awesome creative team was never as simple as that. After a death in the family, the Batman editor Denny O'Neil tried a number of writers for the main Batman title, but none of them quite worked. One of those writers was Marv Wolfman, best known as the writer who revitalized the New Teen Titans in the 1980s, and who had written only a handful of Batman stories in the past. Wolfman was chosen to write the introduction of Tim Drake as the new Robin in Batman Year 3 and A Lonely Place of Dying. Both stories were successful because Marv Wolfman had a gift for writing teenage characters such as Nightwing and Robin. However, he was not much of a Batman writer, and after a series of lackluster stories, he was replaced by Peter Milligan, a writer who was very interested in weird stories about dark magic and occult themes. His most popular storyline is called Dark Knight, Dark City, the story that reinvented the Riddler as a violent, psychotic, and murderous maniac. Milligan's interest in the dark and bizarre themes resulted in Batman stories that were very strange and esoteric, and after a while it became clear that he didn't know how to write superhero stories, so he was also replaced in less than a year. Eventually, Denny O'Neil finally decided to hire Doug Moench, the writer who had a criminally underrated Batman run in the early 1980s. But now that Batman was big and popular, Moench was brought back to prove just how good of a Batman writer he was. Doug Moench and the legendary Batman artist Jim Aparo were assigned to the Batman title. Lastly, O'Neil needed to find a solid creative team for Detective Comics, and after another grueling process of finding the right people, he eventually settled for writer Chuck Dixon and artist Tom Lyle. Despite being the younger creators out of all of them, Dixon and Lyle had proven to be a great team, creating the first Robin miniseries featuring Tim Drake, and the success of those series allowed them to become the creative team in charge of Detective Comics. However, only a few months after they had begun their run, artist Tom Lyle decided to go work for Marvel, and so DC Comics hired Graham Nolan as the main artist in Detective Comics. Finally, after years of struggling to find the right writers and artists, the Batman comics had found a group of excellent creators, and editor Denny O'Neil decided to organize them under a single creative mindset, where world building and continuity were the first priority of their stories. For this purpose, they expanded the cast of characters of Gotham City, reintroducing old characters like Lieutenant Harvey Bullock, Detective Sarah Essen, and even new characters like Officer Renee Montoya, turning the GCPD into active characters in their stories. They also introduced a new version of Ace the Bat-Hound, and the technical genius called Harold, who was a hunchback that lived in the Batcave and created gadgets for Batman. However, these two characters were an editorial idea that none of the writers really liked, which is why they barely used these characters. With all of these changes, the main three Batman comics were connected by the events that happened in each title, and this approach allowed them to create multi-chapter crossovers between the Batman titles, with the first and most notable crossover coming out by the end of 1991, in the storyline called The Destroyer. In the story, a maniac sets out to destroy the modern buildings of Gotham, leaving only the old buildings of the city standing. The concept for this story came from the mind of Denny O'Neil, who wanted to capitalize on the newfound popularity of Batman thanks to the Batman movie. In order to streamline the continuity of the comics and make them more similar to the film, O'Neil hired the Academy Award winner and production designer of the Batman movie, Anton Furst. For this story, Furst created concept illustrations of the old Gotham, based on the same style and architecture that he used in the movie. And for the first time in history, Gotham City became a recognizable character in the comics. The massive, tall, and ominous-looking buildings reflected the darkness that existed in the city, and all the Batman comics immediately incorporated these designs into the stories. Gotham City gained an identity, a distinct personality, and it looked better than ever. Gotham City looked so good that it seemed as if nothing could ever bring it down. By 1992, the Gotham City of the comics had become just like the Gotham City from the movie, which was a genius decision by DC Comics, considering that the long-awaited and highly anticipated sequel to the first Batman movie came out in the summer of that year. Batman Returns was the second Batman movie directed by Tim Burton, who brought back Michael Keaton as Batman and introduced Danny DeVito as the Penguin, with Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman. Batman Returns was yet another commercial success, although not on the same level as the first movie. The sequel received mixed reactions from critics and the general audience, some of whom loved the new operatic experience while others considered the movie was a bit too dark. Though Batman Returns reinforced the image of Batman as an international pop culture icon, it was not the only Batman adaptation to the mainstream media in 1992, as in September of that same year, Batman the Animated Series was released and it became an instant success, receiving an overwhelming positive reception from just about everyone. The series was praised for the serious tone of the episodes that showcased a mature Batman, without going overboard into the dark and gritty territory. The animation style, the storytelling, the music, the character design, the voice acting, just the amount of work, passion and dedication that went into the production of every single episode is what makes people consider these one of, if not the absolute best adaptation of the Batman mythos. Much of the success of Batman the Animated Series comes from the fact that the show adapted many of the greatest Batman stories and not one of them involved Frank Miller's Batman. Instead, BTAS adapted classic Batman stories from the Bronze Age of comics, the most underrated era in the history of Batman. As a result, the show brought some much-needed attention to some characters that were unknown by the mainstream audiences, such as Man-Bat, Ra's al Ghul, Poison Ivy, the Mad Hatter, and most notably, Mr. Freeze, who was an obscure and rather laughable character until the creators of the series turned him into a tragic and sympathetic villain, making him one of the most popular enemies of Batman. Similarly, they introduced Harley Quinn, the lovable hench girl and occasional girlfriend of the Joker, who would go on to become one of the most popular characters in the entire DC universe. The huge success of Batman the Animated Series convinced Warner Bros. To create an animated movie based on the show. Batman Mask of the Phantasm premiered on Christmas Day of 1993, and although it was a box office disappointment as a result of poor marketing, it went on to become one of the best-selling movies in the subsequent years, when it released in multiple home video systems. Not only that, Mask of the Phantasm is widely considered one of the greatest Batman movies ever made.
Batman Mask of the Phantasm was big-time entertainment. I really liked it.
The popularity of the series allowed Warner Bros. And DC Comics to create all sorts of merchandise and products, with the most popular being the multiple video games and the comic books based on the show. The animated series remained popular for over 3 years thanks to their constant use of comic books as their main source of inspiration. In the later seasons of the show, they even started introducing newer characters from the comics, like the Ventriloquist and the Scarface, while also adapting more recent and iconic storylines that defined the Batman comics in the 90s. With 2 new movies and a successful animated series, Batman dominated the mainstream media in 1992, and DC Comics took advantage of this newfound popularity by creating interesting and groundbreaking stories. First, they introduced Elseworlds, which were basically stories that existed in alternate universes. The 1989 story Gotham by Gaslight was the first of such stories, where a Victorian Batman goes up against the legendary killer Jack the Ripper. The success of that graphic novel led to the creation of the Elseworlds brand in 1991, with the first official Elseworlds being Batman: Holy Terror, followed shortly by the visually amazing Batman and Dracula: Red Rain, marking the first collaboration between writer Doug Moench and artist Kelly Jones. However, DC Comics was not the only company making groundbreaking developments. Over at Marvel, a young group of artists were breaking sales records one after the other thanks to their spectacular visual style. Artists like Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, and many others started developing a new way of presenting comic book heroes, making the girls very sexy and stylish, and the boys very violent and brutal. This new kind of heroes found tremendous success in the early 90s, to the point where these artists successfully started their own company called Image Comics in 1992, a company that was focused entirely on cool-looking characters and extreme and violent anti-heroes. The Batman editor and veteran comic book writer Denny O'Neil saw the rising popularity of these characters and realized that they were a direct consequence of works like The Dark Knight Returns, which popularized the idea of dark and violent heroes. As the Batman editor, O'Neill felt the responsibility to make a statement about the current state of the comic book industry, and using Batman as the character that literally started the trend, he decided to show people why these characters don't work. In 1992, Denny O'Neill gathered his group of talented writers and artists, and they were also joined by Archie Goodwin, another legendary creator who became part of the Batman team as the editor of Legends of the Dark Knight. With this team of prolific creators, O'Neill started developing the biggest and most ambitious Batman story ever created as a year-long project that they called Knightfall. The original concept for the storyline consisted of Batman suffering some sort of injury and being replaced for a short time. One of the Batman writers had suggested this concept in the late 1980s, but it wasn't until 1992 that Denny O'Neill took that concept and, alongside his team of artists and writers, they developed this idea into a massive crossover. To make Knightfall work, they started introducing elements of the storyline as far back as 1 year before it all started. The villain that would defeat Batman was created by Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan, drawing a lot of inspiration from an earlier Denny O'Neill story called Batman Venom. This massive brute, who was also a criminal genius, was called Bane, and he would be the man to break the Bat. In the meantime, Denny O'Neill created the character that would replace Batman and introduced him as Azrael, a brainwashed assassin who becomes part of the Batman family in the months leading up to the breaking of Batman. When the moment finally came and Bruce Wayne was broken by Bane, DC Comics moved on with their plan and established Azrael as the new Batman. The first appearance of Azrael as the new Batman, with his own metallic batsuit, was published in the summer of 1993 in Batman number 500, the first Batman comic book in more than 20 years to sell more than 1 million copies, a record that has never again been replicated in the Batman comics. The introduction of the new Batman had been a total success, and the plan was going well. In fact, it went a little too well. Denny O'Neill had wanted to show people why violent and brutal heroes don't work, and after introducing their new violent and brutal Batman, he was proven right when the sales of the Batman comics slowly started to drop each month after the change happened. Despite being the most successful Batman storyline and the most ambitious one at that point, DC Comics had to cut short the saga of Asbats, creating a very abrupt ending in order to bring back Bruce Wayne, as people were just tired of the Psycho Batman after barely a year. Regardless of the abrupt ending, Knightfall became, and remains to this day, one of the greatest Batman stories of all time, as it showcased not only an extraordinary chapter in the history of Batman, but it also served as an example of the incredible artistic and editorial coordination of the Batman comics during those years. But perhaps most importantly, Knightfall was a story that had something to say. It was a critical examination about the state of the comic book industry that reflected on the dangers of violent anti-heroes, and using the speculation boom at the time, they told an amazing storytelling project of epic proportions that became both critically and commercially successful. Unfortunately, this would also mark the end of Batman's winning streak in the 90s. Knightfall was certainly not the last Batman crossover of the 90s, but it was the last successful one. Soon after Knightfall, DC Comics published Zero Hour, a massive event that rebooted elements of the continuity of the entire DC universe. And after that, DC followed up Knightfall with Prodigal, the story where the original Robin, Dick Grayson, becomes Batman for the first time. Prodigal was a much shorter crossover that lasted only for a couple of months, as DC had learned an important lesson with Knightfall about dragging a storyline longer than necessary. After Prodigal was finished, the Batman comics entered a brief period in which every title was free from crossovers, and each creative team was allowed to make the stories they wanted to tell. In Detective Comics, Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan presented stories about Batman and Robin working together in traditional crime-fighting adventures. It was around this time that Dixon and Nolan reinvented the character of the Penguin as a legitimate businessman, introducing the Iceberg Lounge. Meanwhile, over in Batman, writer Doug Moench was paired with Kelly Jones, who became the new Batman artist after illustrating all the covers for Knightfall, and together they focused on the strange, bizarre, and horror elements of the Batman mythos, with stories in which the Dark Knight was almost always alone. Similarly, Alan Grant continued creating great Batman stories in Shadow of the Bat, alongside a number of different artists, and all of the main Batman titles showcase the character growth and evolution of Batman after the events of Nightfall. The Batman comics were also very quick to adapt the most groundbreaking developments from the mainstream media. Inspired by the sexy portrayal of Catwoman in Batman Returns, DC Comics created the first Catwoman comic book, illustrated by Jim Balent, that focused a lot on the sex appeal of the character. Similarly, thanks to the success of Mr. Freeze in Batman the Animated Series and a new character design by Kelly Jones, Denny O'Neil was finally convinced to give Mr. Freeze a chance to return to the comics, after years of being forgotten and forbidden from being used. The character design of Batman was also updated in the aftermath of Nightfall and Prodigal, when he finally abandoned the blue and grey batsuit of the last 50 years in favor of a new black batsuit, similar to the one from the movies. The time period between 1990 and 1994 was an extremely interesting time to be a Batman fan. With 2 new movies, a brand new animated series, and epic sagas in the comic books, there was no shortage of good stories for every kind of Batman fan. Unfortunately, keeping up this level of quality and success proved to be too much for the people in charge of Batman, and by the mid-90s, things started to fall apart. The downfall of Batman in the 90s doesn't have a clear starting point, but the first sign of trouble was definitely the return of Frank Miller. See, I told you he was going to come back, remember? In 1984, DC Comics collaborated with Image Comics and presented the Batman Spawn crossovers. There were 2 separate books, one published by DC and created by all the main Batman writers at the time, and another one written by Frank Miller, with art by Todd McFarlane. This crossover marked the return of both Miller and McFarlane to Batman since the late 1980s, and although their story is very strange and most of the time it doesn't make any sense, it still went on to become the best-selling comic book of 1994. It's very ironic how the Batman comics spent almost 2 years criticizing violent anti-heroes in comic books, only to reach best-selling status by teaming up with the poster boy for violent anti-heroes. According to Chuck Dixon, one of the writers of the Batman Spawn story for DC, the production of this crossover reignited the old feud between Frank Miller and Denny O'Neil. When Image Comics sent the Frank Miller script with samples of the art from the story to Denny O'Neil, the Batman editor was livid and completely insulted when he read the final page of the story. Here, Batman violently attacks Spawn with a batarang to the face, after Spawn had suggested to bury the hatchet between the two of them. In other words, Frank Miller literally chose violence when he brought back that dark and gritty Batman and created this ending as a way to send a very clear message to the man in charge of Batman. Denny O'Neil, however, didn't have time for drama, as only 1 year later, in 1995, he made one of the greatest changes of the 90s, when Nightwing officially became part of the Batman comics. For the longest time, Nightwing was a character exclusive for the Teen Titans comics, and for the best part of the early 90s, Denny O'Neil worked hard to convince the higher-ups at DC Comics to let him handle Nightwing as part of the Batman comics. In 1995, he finally succeeded, and to mark the occasion, he created the first Nightwing miniseries, alongside artists Brian Stelfreeze and Greg Land, and altogether they introduced a new character design for Nightwing. And ever since then, this went on to become the most iconic Nightwing design of all time, and it wouldn't take long before Nightwing got his own comic book series in 1996, joining the already extensive list of Batman spin-offs, which included Robin, Catwoman, and Azrael, besides the 4 main Batman comics, plus the comic adaptation of the animated series. The Batman office at DC Comics was huge, and it had grown because of Batman's success in the early 90s. However, by 1995, the sales of the comics were not doing great, and in order to revitalize and boost sales, DC Comics went back to crossovers. The first one was called Contagion, a story where a deadly virus spreads across Gotham and decimates the population. The story was quickly followed up with another crossover called Legacy, which revealed that the mastermind behind the virus was none other than Ra's al Ghul, now working together with Bane. Although Contagion and Legacy were somewhat epic crossovers, they didn't come close to replicating the success of Knightfall, and one of the main reasons for that is the motivation behind the stories. Knightfall was motivated by the need to tell a great story about an issue that was important to all the creators involved, while Contagion and Legacy were an obvious attempt to capture the attention of readers with popular trends and gimmicks. In the mid-90s, the topic of contagious viruses was very popular, thanks to best-selling novels and blockbuster movies, so DC Comics decided to join the bandwagon and created stories that didn't feel as complete or interesting as Knightfall. The main problem was that these crossovers were not entirely motivated by storytelling, but rather by greed. By the mid-90s, DC Comics would try anything to grab the attention of readers, and one of these ideas was to create more stories featuring the Riddler and Two-Face, as both of these characters were the main villains of the new Batman movie. Batman Forever was the third movie in the cinematic Batman franchise, and it was a complete departure from the two previous films. Warner Bros. Was not happy with the box office performance of Batman Returns, and most importantly, they were not happy with the complexities of merchandising a movie that was a bit too dark. In order to maximize the profits and make as much money as they had made with the first Batman movie, Warner Bros. Replaced everyone in the production team of the movies, starting with director Tim Burton, who was replaced by Joel Schumacher. Schumacher then cast Val Kilmer as the new Batman, and alongside Chris O'Donnell as Robin, Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face and Jim Carrey as the Riddler, they presented Batman Forever, a movie that is divided between a deep, serious character drama and a bombastic explosion of neon and nonsense. The polarizing nature of Batman Forever extended to the critical reception, with some people claiming it was better than the previous films, while others couldn't even understand how this movie got made in the first place. Regardless, Batman Forever went on to become an even bigger box office and merchandising success than Batman Returns, which convinced Warner Bros. That this was the right direction to make money with Batman, to the point where the studio immediately started production on the sequel and doubled down on the more commercial aspects, completely disregarding any artistic integrity in the process. After barely 2 years of work, Batman and Robin was released and became the biggest failure that the Batman franchise has ever experienced. The movie was both a commercial and critical disaster, completely destroying the reputation of Batman in the movies that had been so carefully developed in the late 80s and early 90s. Batman and Robin received an abysmal critical reception, and combined with a poor performance at the box office, the movie officially ended the cinematic Batman franchise, as the studio realized that they had damaged the image of the character beyond repair. Not only that, the movie also destroyed the images of Bane, Poison Ivy, and Mr. Freeze, all of them characters that had found huge success thanks to the iconic comics from the early 90s and the great stories of Batman the Animated Series, which they tried to replicate in the movie with awful results. In fact, the damage caused by the movie Batman and Robin extended even to the animated series, as in 1997, Warner Bros. Decided to create a brand new season of the classic show, although this time featuring a different animation style and showcasing Batgirl as a permanent member of the team, to be more in line with the live-action movie. The result was The New Batman Adventures, a show that is often considered to be the final season of Batman the Animated Series. And although the show is quite decent and features some of the best episodes of the entire series, it still remains a very polarizing chapter in the animated history of Batman, with a large part of the fanbase outright rejecting the new character designs, the new stories, and the new animation style, all of which were radically different from what came before. In the eyes of many people, the new Batman Adventures is inferior to the original animated series, and it's a blemish in what could have been a perfect animated show. Thankfully, this was not the final chapter of the animated Batman in the 90s, as Warner Bros. Had also started production on another animated movie, this time featuring Mr. Freeze because of his role in the live-action live-action movie. Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero was released in 1998, and it featured the classic style of the original animated series, presenting one final story about the tragedy and redemption of Mr. Freeze, marking the last time Freeze was considered a major Batman enemy, capable of being the main villain of his own movie, before that reputation was completely lost. Sub-Zero has always been criminally underrated for being a direct-to-video movie that not many people know it even exists. For this reason, it becomes not only a bittersweet ending to the character of Mr. Freeze, but also a bittersweet ending to the iconic animated Batman that not only defined the character in the 90s, but for decades to come. As a result of the terrible live-action movies and the polarizing animated series, Batman lost his grip over the mainstream audiences, and all that was left were the comic book fans, who had one final moment of glory before everything came crashing down. By 1996, the Batman comics were having troubles, as they kept alternating between convoluted crossovers and standalone stories that were mostly enjoyed by a very niche audience. In order to capture the attention of more readers, something big needed to happen, and that something came from the mind of editor Archie Goodwin, who realized that it had been 10 years since the definitive origin of Batman was told in Batman Year One, and he saw a great opportunity to finally make a proper sequel to that story. Archie Goodwin then hired writer Jeff Loeb and artist Tim Sale, a creative team with whom he had already worked on a couple of Halloween specials, and he suggested them to make a true crime story focused on the gangsters of Gotham from Batman Year One. With this idea in mind, Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale created Batman: The Long Halloween, which became an instant classic and still remains one of the best Batman stories of all time. The publication of The Long Halloween lasted for a whole year, between 1996 and 1997, a time when the comic book industry was still dominated by the violent and extreme anti-heroes, as well as the hypersexualized girls. Without many other options in the market, and with the main Batman comics failing to create special stories, The Long Halloween became the best Batman comic book that every Batman fan waited for every month for an entire year. The story was so different from the other comic books at the time thanks to a unique visual style inspired by film noir, an intriguing murder mystery, and the grounded, mature, elaborated, almost operatic nature of the story allowed The Long Halloween to become one of the most successful Batman stories to come out of the 90s, and one that is still relevant to this day. The success of The Long Halloween could not have been possible without the genius of editor Archie Goodwin, who unfortunately passed away in 1998, shortly after finishing The Long Halloween. Archie Goodwin was a visionary man, whose incredible talent was only surpassed by the kindness of his heart, and the tragic loss of this titan marked the beginning of the end for the Batman comics in the 90s. The downfall of Batman came to a head when DC Comics spent the best part of the last couple of years of the 90s destroying everything that they had built in the last decade. By the end of 1997, the sales of the Batman comics had dropped significantly, and although part of the reason was the decline of Batman's image as a result of the awful movie, another important factor was the lack of variety in the main Batman comics. At this point, it had been almost 7 years of the same creative teams from the early 90s, and beyond a very niche and dedicated but small fanbase, not many people were picking up the Batman comics. In order to boost and reinvigorate the sales, DC Comics decided once again to go back to crossovers, this time with another shocking gimmick where Gotham City was completely destroyed by an earthquake. It was called Cataclysm, and it was this weird story where DC Comics decided to showcase the complete and total destruction of that dark and perfect Gotham that they had carefully created and designed for Batman only a few years back. Watching the entire legacy that had taken so long to create come crumbling apart felt wrong, but the disasters didn't end there. Immediately after Cataclysm, DC Comics came up with another idea for a massive crossover, one that would be even bigger than Nightfall, and would take place over the entire year of 1999. It was called No Man's Land, a story where the US government decides to abandon Gotham City after the earthquake, and Batman has to find a way to fight chaos in a land with no law and no order. The idea behind No Man's Land was to make radical changes in order to make the comics interesting for new readers, and part of this overhaul was the abrupt replacement of all the creative teams of the Batman comics. In 1998, the Batman editors decided to hire Hollywood screenwriter Bob Gale as the new Batman writer to start off No Man's Land. DC Comics expected that Bob Gale would bring in new readers, as he was really popular because he wrote the Back to the Future movies, which, by the way, do you remember that scene in the second movie where the old Marty McFly is fired via fax? Well, that scene was written by Bob Gale, and in a very suspicious and coincidental twist of irony, this is exactly how DC Comics fired the previous Batman writers. Doug Moench, Alan Grant, and Chuck Dixon unexpectedly received a brief notice over a fax message telling them that they had all been fired. The decision was so abrupt and unexpected that they couldn't even finish their runs properly. Writer Alan Grant had already created a new villain called The Answer, and the character appeared in the Batman villain's Secret Files and Origins, explaining his involvement in the upcoming No Man's Land. However, because Grant was fired so suddenly, the character never actually appeared except for this one page. But even worse is what happened to Doug Moench and Kelly Jones, who were in charge of the Batman title for the last 3 years, cultivating a small but dedicated fan following. These hardcore fans noticed that from the very start of their stories, Moench and Jones always included a mysterious puppeteer that pulled the strings of a small Batman marionette in random panels of almost every single one of their stories. This mysterious character was following Batman and Bruce Wayne everywhere, and according to artist Kelly Jones, they were going to finish off their run introducing a new villain, as some sort of evil puppet master, and it was planned to be the most epic finale to their run. However, because they were all fired so abruptly, none of these ever happened. I guess it's true what they say about life imitating art, because No Man's Land was a story about the US government abandoning their people, and it all started when DC Comics abandoned theirs. No Man's Land went on to become the most polarizing Batman story of 1999, mostly because it was the only Batman story of 1999. The massive crossover extended over the course of a whole year and more than 10 different comic books each month, creating a big problem with readers who were absolutely burned out on crossovers. The Batman fanbase is now completely divided on No Man's Land. Some people love the story for the dark, grounded and gritty concepts that were interesting and novel at the time, and for introducing a new Batgirl and bringing Harley Quinn into the main Batman comics. However, a large number of people argue that No Man's Land is unnecessarily long, and it doesn't make any sense, especially considering how it destroyed the character development of Batman from the previous storylines, and how under such big circumstances, the rest of the DC universe should have played a more important role in the story. The whole concept behind No Man's Land was to make an epic story that had something important to say, like Nightfall. With No Man's Land, DC Comics sought to explore the downfall of society, hoping to make a connection with the upcoming new millennium and the fear surrounding the year 2000 and the collapse of technology that would destroy society. Unfortunately, that concept didn't translate well to the story at all. Even though No Man's Land is one of the most iconic Batman stories of all time, it is far from perfect. The lack of experience from the new writers, the inconsistent art all throughout the crossover, and the minimal preparation that didn't even come close to the work done in Nightfall are just some of the reasons why No Man's Land failed to connect with readers and created this excessively long, polarizing storyline that killed and destroyed a lot of what made the Batman mythos special in the 90s. And to finish off the decade, DC Comics presented one final story called Batman: Dark Victory, which is a retelling of the origin story of Dick Grayson as the first Robin. As the sequel to The Long Halloween, Dark Victory became even more commercially successful, mostly thanks to the popularity of The Long Halloween, and also because the Batman readers at the time were starved for good, streamlined stories that were not part of massive crossovers. Though Dark Victory was a commercial success upon release, the critical reception was not ideal. Dark Victory has always been considered inferior to The Long Halloween, as readers felt that this sequel was a rehash of that story, that it used the same tropes and the same formula without reaching the same levels of quality. In that sense, Dark Victory became yet another product of the late 90s, where creators tried to replicate the success of the past without really understanding what made those things great in the first place. The history of Batman in the 90s serves as an example of how really good things can easily be destroyed when the people in charge of the big decisions push the franchises into strange directions, turning them into shallow parodies of themselves for the sake of profit. Fortunately, this was not entirely the case with Batman, because although the character certainly suffered a decline in the quality of his stories as a result of greedy executives, there were still creative and passionate individuals working on Batman who believed in the stories they were telling and tried to do their best work given the circumstances. And there is no better example of this than the final mainstream Batman series, created in the 90s. Batman Beyond was initially born out of a corporate decision to create a new animated series to appeal to younger audiences at the turn of the new millennium. The studio executives wanted a show about a teenage Batman, something that could have easily turned into yet another disaster, and possibly the final nail in the coffin for Batman in the 90s. But fortunately, it turned out to be the exact opposite. Batman Beyond was released in 1999 and it was a massive success, becoming one of the most beloved animated adaptations of Batman and a timeless masterpiece that becomes even better with each year and gains more popularity as time goes by. The story of Terry McGinnis in Batman Beyond represents a new hope for Batman, as in the following decade the Batman franchise would find new ways to succeed, with even more iconic and groundbreaking stories, and all thanks to a new generation. The success of Batman Beyond is an excellent example that even when some projects are born out of a business, greedy mindset, they can still become an everlasting and influential work of art, thanks to the dedication and creativity of a group of passionate artists who prioritize their artistic integrity above financial gain. And that should be the biggest lesson that Batman Beyond leaves us with, as it is not only an excellent animated show, but also the absolute greatest way to finish off the 90s, the decade when greed broke Batman. Friends, thank you so much for watching this video. This is a very important milestone on the channel, as we finally close the chapter of Batman in the 90s, and I can't wait to share the new chapter in the history of Batman with all of you. As always, a massive thanks to my patrons for supporting my work and for always making these videos possible. And a special thanks to all of you who stay to the very end of the videos. I really love you guys. Anyways, I shall be back very soon with a brand new video. Until then, stay safe out there and I'll see you in the next one.